This is Chapter 10, Sexualities from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, and Institutions. So one of the main questions the chapter poses is how is our sexuality influenced by ideas, interactions, and institutions? So I'm sure if you reflect, you can name many ways in which you've observed how sexuality, whether it's yours or sexuality of your, close loved ones, peers, has been influenced by ideas, interactions, or institutions. So to understand the current context, we have to look at the history to kind of understand what our current context is built upon. So in 1960, the Supreme Court granted married people the unrestricted right to use birth control. So if you know a little bit about Margaret Sanger, then you know a little bit about the history of the birth control pill itself. And what's interesting about Margaret Sanger as a person, she did a lot of good work, but of course she was also swept into the eugenics kind of ideology of the time period and used some of that rhetoric as a way to gain popular support for a birth control pill. Without her and her, courageous work, we probably wouldn't have the birth control pill, at least not at the time period when it did finally arrive in 1960. So what's interesting is the Supreme Court granted married people the right to use birth control in 1960, but it wasn't until 1972 that birth control was extended to single people in the United States. And then it was only 1 year later that abortion was legalized. So again, this was just, the Supreme Court legalized abortion only for the first and second trimesters. So I know there's a lot of rhetoric out in the culture, especially after former President Donald Trump would say all of these inflammatory things that were just not true about the idea that people abort until the day they give birth. That is not the case. That is not what legal abortion is in the United States. It never has been. It's really only access to abortion during first and second trimesters. The only times in which there's like a special medical consideration where a woman is dying, would they ever consider anything like that in the third trimester? So that's kind of part of the rhetoric around the politics related to this sexuality understandings in the culture. And again, it's interesting, there's been more attacks on abortion access and Roe v. Wade since 2010 than since 1973. So this kind of modern era, we see quite an attack on abortion access. And again, think about all the things that having access to birth control and abortion affected for women. Look at the time period in which this happened. Right? This is happening right at that second wave of the women's rights movement. So you have women now gaining access to, career fields that were legally or otherwise socially restricted for them. You had women entering more higher education, and being able to enter career fields and higher education, part of the essential nature of that is having control over your own body and being able to choose whether or not family planning, whether or not you have children or not. So, the baby boomers, their desires to find their own way led into the growth of the women's movement, gay liberation, and sexual revolution. So these movements reinforced permissive attitudes about sex, and the timing was perfect, right? Here you can also know how there's a lot of attitudes that are tied into these court cases, right? The idea that the women's rights movement, the second wave of the women's rights movement in the 1960s and into the 70s was really focused on this idea of equity and equality, that women were not just passive with sexuality, that they had a sexuality, right? Before this, it was considered that men had a sexuality and women just kind of grin and bear it, right? But it's not until this time when we get to kind of the early stages of what then becomes the sexual revolution in the late 60s that we start kind of separating sex from reproduction, right? And understanding that women can also enjoy their sexuality. And this kind of younger movement of younger people, this demographic shift of the baby boomers, they were really able to kind of change a lot of our cultural notions about who should be able to have sex, about sex being fun, and about having less fear of an unintended pregnancy while engaging in, sexual behaviors. So once we get to 1969, we have the Stonewall Uprising, or Stonewall Riots as it's often called. This was when a group of trans, gay, and non-binary individuals protested police harassment in several nights of protest that became known as the Stonewall Riots. So I added some videos to your additional resources to, kind of cover some of this as well. But, there's a film I show in another class of mine, in my Sexualities class, that really looks at this, and that's why I just put a couple clips in there for you. But you can find the full film online for free. But what's fascinating too is just the way in which the time period, the youth movements, this kind of coalesced around, instead of being harassed and detained and treated like crap, people they were pushed too far. And they stood up and they fought the police. And it was a really interesting turning point. And what came out of that was the first, gay pride parade, which are now happen all over the world every year, and are almost even like commercialized at this point. You have like Pepsi as part of the sponsors. But it's really interesting in the film. It's called, Stonewall Uprising. It's a PBS documentary. They talk about how the first gay pride was really what they called it, the first, pride run, because they were very scared that, someone was going to come with a gun or a bomb. There were bomb threats. They were people that were literally targeted for violence in society. So it was pretty natural to assume that there was going to be some sort of violence. So people were marching pretty fast, and it wasn't until they turned the corner and started kind of gaining more momentum that they realized just how many people turned out to support this movement in New York City, and it just kind of changed the whole momentum, right? And this is in the same time period where homosexuality, it was being re-understood in the culture. So even the understandings of heterosexuality and homosexuality, the terms heterosexual, homosexual, do not appear until the 1880s in medical textbooks. And so, homosexuality was considered, again, if you make heterosexuality the hegemony or the dominant group or the group that's just assumed to be normal, then anyone who's not heterosexual is like somehow there's something wrong with them. And that's really the way that people considered this in the United States. It was pathologized, right? Meaning we use the medical terminology and system to stigmatize and often, very harshly punish people because of their same-sex desires. So you had, with the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders. So basically, it's a list of mental disorders, and they considered homosexuality a mental disorder until 1973. So life was changing during that time period for sexual minorities and for trans men and women. And so a number of critical events for these communities occurred, like the Stonewall Riots, the founding of the Gay Liberation Front, gay pride parades, and again, being removed from the APA's list of mental disorders was really important to creating a situation in society where people could come out, right? Because as they discuss in the film Stonewall Uprising, before Stonewall there was no coming out, right? There was no visibility because visibility was being targeted. Literally people were sent, because it was considered a mental disorder, often to be institutionalized within medical facilities. Right, so you had people that had to go through conversion or aversion therapies. So basically where they, either give you an electroshock when you watch same-sex pornography, or maybe inject you with a chemical that makes you really nauseous and feel like sick, so that you develop some sort of negative association with seeing same-sex activity. The idea being that if you could just rewire someone's brain, you could change their sexual desires, which obviously is not how that works. So in the most extreme cases, some people were lobotomized, where they would remove the frontal lobe of their brain to remove the same-sex desire. Of course, then those people were just vegetables, right? They couldn't talk. They could just do basic, kind of human functions, but they weren't people anymore. And so this kind of hubris, this quest to cure something that wasn't a disease, really motivated the understandings of homosexuality at that time period. It was criminalized. It was targeted. And so once the APA takes homosexuality out of the DSM, this just kind of opens up the door for new understandings about, different sexual minority groups, right? And so the problem, though, too, is that it's not as if this mobilization led to a lot of protections early on. So we have this situation in the 1980s where gay men's communities were devastated by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And it's really important to note that the devastation of the HIV/AIDS epidemic was due to the slowness of politicians to support research, prevention, and treatment. So gay men themselves organized the most effective safe sex campaign the world's ever seen because largely, well, specifically the first George Bush, and really even, when it first emerged, it was ignored. It was largely ignored. Now think about this. Why? Why, again, in the context of now living through COVID, why would we ignore a viral disease that kills people? Well, at the time period, the only people that were dying, well, again, it wasn't the only people, but it was the majority of the people dying from HIV/AIDS in the early years were gay men and intravenous drug users, meaning people that use needles to do drugs. So think about this for a second. Why would the government not intervene to save these people? Because of their social status. Because they were considered not worthy in the culture anyway, right? Drug addicts and people that were sexual minorities. So there was this kind of cavalier approach of let them die, until they realized, oh, right, heterosexuals also get this disease. And a lot of people actually ended up getting HIV/AIDS because they would go in for a routine blood transfusion and end up with blood that was donated that had HIV in it and develop the disease themselves. And so then once this was kind of realized, once we get to more the 90s, it was too late, and it had already spread and become a global pandemic. And now when you look at the cases of HIV/AIDS, the areas of the world that are still ravaged by HIV/AIDS also have to do with power and privilege. So the most cases that happen to date right now are in sub-Saharan Africa, where women have no right to their own bodies and often can be married out at 12 or 13 years old. And, as a result, they are dying at these high rates because, again, they don't have the medicines to prevent contact. They don't have a lot of the treatment options that we have in the Western world because of privilege and money and all of these things. So we can still see a power relationship of why don't we do something about it, right? There's actually been some interesting kind of almost cures that have been developed in recent years for HIV/AIDS. And so this is developing, but think about it. This was something that came about in the 80s, right? We could develop a vaccine for other diseases relatively quickly when we think it affects everybody. So really, who a disease affects also affects the way that we understand how important it is to solve. So this is an interesting kind of phenomenon, at least in the context now that we've been through a global pandemic together, is just how really stupid and short-sighted it was to not have any, kind of task force or government kind of mandated approach to make sure that HIV/AIDS was dealt with. But again, it was considered, oh, it's a homosexual disease, so let them die. And it really shows the ideology of that time period. Okay, so moving on to some of the terminology from the chapter. Sexual objectification is the reduction of a person to their sex appeal. So, men, women, non-binary people, everybody is objectified in popular culture. And gay men tend to be objectified much more than heterosexual men. But of course, women overall are objectified much more than any other group. So now there's so much competition for attention in the media that content has learned that to get the attention, they often use sex in the media. And women are conventionally portrayed as sex objects and sexually objectified. Right? So I'm sure you can think of many examples of sexual objectification in shows or TV shows or, films or things like that you watch. And the problem too is that it's not that it's bad to look good or feel good, because oftentimes having an embodied sense of self and feeling confident in your sexuality and in how you look is a good thing. But the idea of sexual objectification is literally taking someone from a subject and turning them into an object. So it doesn't matter how you feel. If you're the sexual object, it doesn't matter if you have autonomy or anything, you're just a thing. And again, it's really important to understand that objectification works in such a way that when you turn someone into a thing, it's the first step in basically doing violence against them or seeing them as less than. So it kind of reflects our cultural value systems that women are often just seen as parts. And we often decompartmentalize them, meaning we'll say things like, oh, I wish I had so-and-so's ass, so-and-so's legs, so-and-so's face, so-and-so's lips, so-and-so's whatever. Like, as if we can kind of surgically craft a woman together, kind of weird science style. And we really look at women in that way. We cut them into pieces instead of looking at them as a unified subject or whole, as a person with, flaws and personality and, all of these things wrapped up into one. Instead, we reduce them to an object, to a chest, to an ass, to these things, instead of, really kind of giving them any dimensionality as a person. And this is really a huge failing of our media system, especially in recent years where, even back in the day in like the 40s, you could have a female character that she could be sexy, but then she could also be a mom, and she could also be the saint, and she could also be the villain. Like, she could have multidimensionality. So it's bizarre that in our modern time period, we think of ourselves as a bit more woke than in the 1940s, but our representations of women are like caricatures and not at all reflective of the kind of dimensionality of actual women. So, going back to the terminology, sexual liberation is viewed as saying yes, right? While saying no is considered old-fashioned or aggressive. So this idea of saying yes grew out of the intersection of the women's movement and the sexual revolution. So what's interesting about the sexual revolution was that it was incredibly tied to feminism. Because the idea was women should be liberated from only being wombs. Women should be able to have sex for fun. Women should be free to make career choices or life choices that don't involve just having kids. And so the idea that women could kind of push past that really moved this sexual liberation ideology. So it was kind of viewed of saying yes to all aspects of sexuality, while saying no or being, again, disinterested was seen as being regressive. So what's interesting about it is feminism itself was so integral to the ideology that women should have rights, that they should stand on equal ground with men, because it was really challenging this kind of ideology at the time that was a sexist idea that women didn't belong to the masculine side of the love-sex binary. So basically the love-sex binary just being the idea that if a heterosexual couple is dating or just interested in some sort of relationship, that a woman wants love and a man wants sex, right? And so feminists were saying, no, that's not always the case, right? Sometimes women just want sex too. And so this kind of androcentric idea that the feminine side of the love-sex binary wasn't valuable or good was also challenged. The idea that like maybe men in sexual encounters could also be in love. And it doesn't just have to be bodies, it can be emotions. And so kind of breaking that weird gender duality expectation, another binary, right? That women only want love in relationships and men don't, and that men only want sex in relationships and women don't, and really pushing past that to this kind of more sexual freedom argument. So the sexual liberation was kind of replaced with sexual freedom. So the imperative to say yes to those old rules was just kind of changed with a new set of rules about sex and sexuality. So real sexual freedom is the right to have sex or not, right? The right to, for any reason, without social consequences, decide to or decide not to. So the kind of early liberation ideas were like, women should be able to have sex, and that's great, because that was pushing past their kind of binaries at that time. But moving into the sexual freedom category, this was more about people being able to actually choose and have autonomy over their bodies at any moment, and really be in tune with their own emotions and feelings, and just kind of what they're ready for and what they're not. And for some people, sexuality is going to be something that's going to be much more personal, and they're not going to share with many people or any people, right? You have people that are asexual and just don't have interest. And then you have people on the other side of that spectrum that are going to be more hypersexual and not have long-term relationships, and that any of these expressions should just be up to the person who's doing them, as long as they're doing it in kind of a healthy, reflective way. Okay, so this kind of goes against the the social norms of the time period before this, right? Such as the Coital Imperative. So the Coital Imperative is the idea that any couple who are fully sexually active must be having penile vaginal intercourse. So the idea that basically sex is to make babies. So the only right way to have sex is procreative sex. So that means no sexual minorities, and really just even for heterosexuals, you shouldn't be having sex that isn't specifically going to result in a baby, which obviously there's plenty of sexual acts that don't result in babies. So it reflects our heteronormative culture and really our mononormative culture, this idea that we should all love and embrace monogamy, which not everyone does. So this constrains sexual options and prioritizes an activity that privileges male orgasms over female orgasms, because as we know, not every woman is going to orgasm from that type of sex. And so instead of it being centered around pleasure or connection or, any of those kind of things, it's centered around reproduction. So the primary assumption of most Americans is that anyone they meet is heterosexual and committed to monogamy. And this just comes from our societal belief systems. Our institutions are organized around those assumptions, so that kind of gives us that assumption as well. So that's what leads to this coital imperative. And the imperative has wide-ranging implications, including that orgasm gap that this chapter discusses, that is often treated as inevitable, right? That in previous generations, the idea was women don't care about having sex. But now, when we understand that women do care, it's like, well, it doesn't matter if she also finds it pleasurable. So it's interesting how we still see that kind of inequity just dragged through different generational kind of understandings. Okay, so then gender also really factors in as to how we understand sex and sexuality. So meaning to be sexy is to be an object of desire, that it's about other people wanting you. So women are considered sexy to be desired, while, instead of being an object, for men, the idea is to be sexual, like to actually be the active verb, right? To have the capacity to experience sexual desire. So the idea that men are sexual and they desire, and women are just the things to be desired. And again, this is reiterated over and over and over and over through our media system and through our cultural norms and practices. So there's this gender love sex binary really feeds into our social understandings of this. So when we think about even sex education, right, how we understand a lot of the things that we're taught is often everything's very centered around, men's sexuality and their pleasure, and this idea that men want to have sex and that they're going to be the driver in that situation. But is there really a gender binary when it comes to desire? Right? Is it only heterosexual men that actually desire sexual relationships? Not necessarily, right? So a lot of this comes from our social understandings, or like even specifically the heterosexual male gaze. The idea that the media reinforces for us a lot of these things, and it becomes, when you're watching so many of these messages over and over and over, whether or not you're really smart and thinking about the context of these things, it's basically a subliminal situation where you just kind of get bombarded with messages over and over and over. So even no matter how, savvy you are, we all absorb and internalize some of these value systems, no matter who we are. Even if we are sexual minorities, we internalize the kind of hierarchies of desire. So again, the media privileges male desire and assumes a heterosexual male gaze, and a lot of representations and characterizations are based on that. So content is designed to appeal to this hypothetical heterosexual man. And so, through this, men kind of go through a process of sexual subjectification where they're told what their internal thoughts and feelings should be, but it's not the same as what goes on with heterosexual women in the culture, which is much more self-objectifying. So whereas men are told they need to be sexual subjects, women are taught they need to be sexual objects. So the heterosexual male gaze just means that women are regularly exposed to idealized images of female bodies. Everyone is. And so those photoshopped, unreal, again, the angles, the lighting, the everything, the makeup, the everything that make these kind of caricaturized images of women somehow appear normal, and real women are compared against these unachievable standards of Photoshop perfection. So many women self-objectify. They internalize the idea that their physical attractiveness determines their worth. And so think about it in this way, though, in a sexuality context. How sexual can you feel if you hate your body, or if you feel ugly or insecure? Right? That translates into a process called spectating within sexuality, right? Where you're too worried about how you look and kind of so again, objectifying yourself is really an idea of, instead of being the eye or like your eyeballs looking out, you're thinking about how someone's looking at you from the outside. And so you're kind of presenting an image of yourself to be ideal to someone from the outside. But what do you lose when you're not a subject? Any sort of personal experience of it, right? You're so caught up in someone else's interpretation of you, you don't get to just be you and kind of subjectively experience that. So, this obviously affects the kind of relationships that can form when one person is taught to be a sexual object and the other person is taught to be a sexual subject. Okay, so then moving on to the erotic marketplace. The erotic marketplace refers to the ways in which people are organized and ordered according to their perceived sexual desirability. So, meaning, who's hot and who's not. That's really often a culturally derived understanding that has a lot to do with, what we preference. And again, don't believe me? Then look cross-culturally. Look at other cultures that have very different notions of beauty and sexuality, and you see theirs are also kind of constructed around their cultural norms and values, just as ours are. But because we've been raised in them, because we've had them our whole lives, because we're in the kind of breathing the air of them, it's difficult to see it happening around you. But it is, right? And so racism and colorism itself too, colorism being within racial group prejudice, the idea that if you're light-skinned, you're preferenced within racialized groups because of the kind of white supremacy in the culture, and this hierarchy of white hegemony means that, people that look white or have white features, have the white hair, that kind of stuff. Texture is what I mean, not the color white. That's a whole other thing, right? But the idea of like the texturing, long hair, all the kind of stuff that's promoted as the dominant beauty understandings in the culture are very white. So that racism and colorism make it so that people that are not light-skinned, people that don't have those features, are not considered as sexually desirable in the culture. And again, it just comes back to that social construction of the gender of race. And so, it impacts who's considered desirable, who's sought after, right? And it leads to this eroticized inequality. So there's other cultural norms that also affect who's considered desirable. And a lot of this kind of fits our notions, the idea that men are dominant, women are submissive, and really fall on a super heteronormative expectation, though we know sexuality is not just heterosexuals. So cultural norms dictate that men in a heterosexual relationship should be taller, stronger, bigger, older, and more educated than their female partners. And so limited research on women seeking women suggests that they have a slight preference for more feminine women. The idea being that even if you're a sexual minority, these notions of gender and what's erotic and what should be desired is also still affecting people that are sexual minorities, because these are strong messages in the culture. So more research has been done on men who are seeking men, and they've found a preference for men who act more straight, quote unquote, whatever that might be. So more of this kind of hegemonic masculinity. So, this idea of trying to present themselves within the confines of what's considered normal in the culture, that becomes more desirable as a partner. So this also comes back to sexual scripts. A sexual script refers to the social rules that guide sexual interactions. The scripts of both mixed-sex and same-sex couples have a somewhat rigid ascending order of intimacy. So the scripts are very gendered as well, meaning there's a masculine role of being assertive, and there's a feminine role of being responsive, or what they call passive, basically, right? The idea of like who asks who out on a date, who's initiating sex, those kind of things. It creates a push and resist dynamic, where it's normal for men to push for sexual activity and women to stop it or slow it down. And again, why is this incredibly problematic? Well, we live in a rape culture, right? As I'll speak about in the next slide. And so the idea that the cultural norm is that it's normal that men, when a woman says, no, I don't want to have sex, that a man would keep pushing for that, right? That's not affirmative consent. When we talk about consent, it's one thing to say, yes, I want to have sex. It's bizarre. It's like you can say, hey, do you want to go out to dinner? Yes. Hey, do you want to have sex? Yes. It's that easy. But the idea is that sometimes we make assumptions based on people's actions, like, well, if this person came home with me, then they are going to have sex with me. When you're like, well, maybe they just wanted to hang out with you after, right? Maybe at the beginning of that time period, they wanted to have sex with you, but now they don't. Like, that's just how consent works. It can be revoked at any time, and it should be respected. So affirmative consent, though, is very different than coercive consent. Affirmative consent is like, what was the example I was using in class the other day? Oh, God, it was terrible. It was like, okay, like Jason Momoa walks in and he's like, hey, do you want to have sex? I'm like, yes. Like, there's affirmative consent. Coercive consent is when someone says, hey, do you want to have sex? And you say, no, no, thank you. I'm not ready. I'm not sure. Maybe. I don't know. And they just keep going, come on, come on, come on, come on. And there's often like a pressure of, so-and-so's girlfriend has sex with them, or any of this kind of pressure that's often found, especially in young peer relationships, in like high school and young adulthood. There's a lot of this coercive consent where a woman might agree to have sex, but she's only doing it after being pestered over and over and over to try and get this person to stop asking. And so that's not the same as like Jason Momoa walks in and you're like, yes, right? So that's the point, is that unless you can reach that affirmative consent, then it's not consent. And so that's why it's so important to understand, again, as we move into this topic of sexual violence, that it's not just about, the cultural norms themselves create a lot of the problems of rape culture because they normalize the idea that men should be sexually aggressive and disregard women when they say no. So when it comes to sexual violence, 1 in 3 women in the United States experiences sexual violence, and 1 in 6 men. It's much higher for men than we think, but when we know that it's a stigma for women to come forward when they're sexually assaulted, then we know it's even more of a stigma for men. Because of the cultural assumptions that men can take care of themselves, that somehow it affects their sexuality if they've been targeted, and it's considered a much more emasculating situation. So a lot of men, even if they do come forward, they're not believed, they're not taken seriously, they don't get the justice that they deserve. So whether men are, whether women or men or non-binary or trans people are the victims, men are the vast majority of perpetrators. They represent 97% of people that are arrested for sexual assault. And so part of the cultural dynamics is victim blaming. This is super common, and this is why so many victims fear coming forward. I mean, the name of it itself tells you what it is. It's basically saying that it's the victim's fault that they got raped. So, that's why 1 out of every 3 assaults is only, if that's how many assaults are reported to the police, at least based on what we know from crime victimization surveys that try and fill in the gaps between what's reported to police and what actually happens. So we know that even if you report it, and this is like, 1/3 of the people who are raped will report it, only 2% of those who are reported ever lead to a conviction. So it's basically like, of the 1/3 that actually report, how many then do they actually find the guy? Do they actually charge the guy? Does the guy actually get convicted? 2%. So it kind of makes sense why people don't come forward, right? Because they are going to be raked over the coals. They're going to say things like, what were you wearing? Were you drinking? Did you have sex with him before? Any of these things that take away from the onus of the crime being on the rapist. It's no one's fault. It doesn't matter what you were wearing. It doesn't matter if you had drinks. Like, that's kind of, especially because we know a lot of this rape culture is prevalent within college campuses. Like, part of college is going to parties and drinking. Like, the idea that women should just not be allowed to do that. Or the idea that women have to change so many things in their daily life to avoid being raped instead of just teaching men not to rape. Right? So we have this weird cultural notion that we don't do to other crimes, right? We're not like, well, of course you got carjacked. Look at that nice car that you're driving around. What did you expect to happen? Right? Or, are you sure you got mugged? Are you sure you didn't just give your watch away to the person with the gun, right? We don't do that with other crimes. We do this with rape, sexual assault, and other sexual crimes. We assume that the person is lying or that somehow they're at fault for not protecting themselves from the assault. And again, rape culture is just this environment that facilitates sexual assault because it justifies it, it naturalizes it, and even glorifies sexual pressure, coercion, and violence. So rape culture views men as naturally aggressive and women as inherently vulnerable to men. So this is that encouraging the push and resist dynamic that, again, justifies rape because it says, well, if it's just natural, then that's why it's happening. But here's the reality. If 1 in 3 women are raped, does that mean 1 in 3 men are rapists? No. Statistically, that's just not how it works. We know that there's a lot of sexual predators that are repeat offenders, right? And so you have, like, for example, Larry Nassar, Bill Cosby, all of these people that you have a couple women come out against them and no one believes it because they're respected, they're highly regarded, right? And then you have like over 60 women against Bill Cosby at this point. So it's pretty clear what happened. But we don't go back and go, oh, maybe she wasn't lying, the first woman that came forward, or the first 10 women that came forward. But what do we do at the beginning? We're like, well, she just wants her 15 minutes of fame. What a liar. Who would lie about, like, who wants to be Google searched and have their name next to that? Nobody, right? People are doing that. It's actually quite courageous in a culture that blames a woman to come forward and say, yeah, this happened to me, is incredibly courageous. And we've seen this through the Me Too movement, through the Time's Up movement, all this kind of stuff. So, but the rape culture itself just glorifies and creates this kind of atmosphere where we just revert to victim blaming. And it's not just men that victim blame, it's often women, right? That will blame each other and say, oh, well, you know, what did she think was going to happen when she went to that frat party? And not realize that, like, someone being roofied and being sexually assaulted is not their fault, right? Someone that's asleep and can't consent, you know, should not be assaulted. It's like that very consent as tea. If you've ever seen that analogy, right? The idea, like, you make someone tea and then they decide they don't want it. You don't force them to drink the tea. You just go, okay. And that's the way that sexuality is supposed to be as well. So the media, though, reflects rape culture in a lot of the ways that it, you know, kind of shows relationships. And especially when it covers sexual force or sexual assault, it, like, sexualizes it. And what's really weird about it is you'd think, well, yeah, it's sexual assault. Of course, there's going to be sex involved. But the idea is sexual assault isn't about, oh, I have such a sexual desire, so I have to do this. It's about domination and control. It's about hurting and keeping someone down. In the same way that sexual harassment isn't about trying to get someone to like you, it's about trying to denigrate them because they don't like you. Same thing with sexual assault. It's control, right? If we say, oh, it's just biological, it's because, you know, men need to pass on their biological stuff. Okay, well, then why does it happen in prison? Is it because they're trying to make babies? No. It's because it's about power and control and domination. And that's what it is, whether it's in prison or not. So when we understand that that's the real dynamics of sexual assault, then we can see rape culture for what it is, how toxic it is, and how it's just like, why do we have a social notions to defend the worst things that happen to people, right? Again, because of the power dynamics in society. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Okay, so this is a good transition into college hookup culture. So college hookup culture is kind of our current definition of sexual liberation. Hookup culture dominates most college campuses because college campuses are often filled with men who are wealthy. You know, you have historically white fraternities have an oversized influence on the college party scene. So they throw parties that facilitate non-romantic, one-time sexual encounters. And so those parties resonate with our current definition of sexual liberation. So we see this in the way that, again, college culture also has a lot of rape culture kind of moving into that as well, as we'll talk about in a minute. So first up, who hooks up with each other? It's interesting, most students overestimate how often their peers hook up with each other and how far they go in a sexual interaction and how much they enjoy it. When it comes to people on campus, fraternity and sorority members tend to hook up about twice as much as everybody else. And again, because they're not going to have consequences or penalties for it. While students who are non-white, poor, working class, or non-heterosexual hook up less frequently. So it kind of comes back to the erotic marketplace. So men and women hook up at similar rates, but women report higher rates of regret, distress, and lowered self-esteem after. Now, what could influence that? Well, there's this kind of, nature of a double standard in our culture. The idea that if a man has a lot of sex or has sex with multiple people, he's rewarded. People are like, great job. But if a woman is seen to be having sex with multiple people, we punish that. We have all sorts of terms for it, right? To denigrate and really stigmatize women if they have sex with like a partner outside of a marriage or something like that. So that's often going to affect how people feel after experiencing hookup culture because, again, there's no social reward for women. There's only social consequences. So gender power is part of this. And so hookup culture is premised on a stereotypically masculine version of sexuality where men have power in sexual interactions. So in hookup culture, if you want to be romantic and have like any sort of connection to this person or get to know them better or, kind of have an emotional as well as sexual relationship, that's considered feminine. And with androcentrism, anything considered feminine is considered bad and to be avoided. So when it comes to sexual pleasure, this kind of also connects. This is why people who are like in married relationships have much better sex and more sex than people in hookup culture. Spoiler. But anyway, sexual pleasure is very unevenly distributed within hookup culture. Women hooking up with men report only 35% as many orgasms as their partners. So maybe 1 out of 3 hookups, someone's having an orgasm, versus men are having one each time, right? So men appear to value their girlfriend's pleasure more. Like if they're having an emotional or connection, like a long-term relationship with someone, but not a hookup partner's pleasure. So in hookup culture, women are not often put first, and women often don't put themselves first within sexual interactions. So sexual pleasure is gendered within hookups. Men reliably have orgasms during intercourse, but women don't. And so many acts like oral sex or penetrative sex are centered around or defined by the penis, which has led to that orgasm gap where women report fewer orgasms than men, though they're free to have these sexual interactions, they're not getting really much from it, right? So when it comes to sexual danger, 1 in 4 senior women or senior college students reported being sexually assaulted while they were in college. And gay and bisexual women are more likely than heterosexual women to report being assaulted. What's interesting is sometimes when people are not interested in heterosexuality, they're often more targeted for sexual violence. So bisexual men are almost as likely as heterosexual women to also be assaulted themselves. So sexual scripts of hookup and rape culture make coercive behaviors look and feel normal, right? I mean, God, if you think about every romance rom-com movie where a guy does some like big gesture, all of those are incredibly toxic. This idea that like someone shows up at your house unannounced with a boombox, like that's stalking. It's weird how we like have romanticized and normalized jealousy and possessiveness and coercive control as if that's good, when it's incredibly toxic and it's really tied to a lot of emotional, physical, and psychological abuse that person might have faced themselves in their own childhood or within their, witnessed in their parents' relationships or things that they're passing on generationally because they haven't gotten therapy and help to really think about the ways in which their actions harm others. So, in addition to that, the many hookups are pursued while students are drunk. So meaning consent is very difficult to obtain, and it puts all the students at risk of perpetrating rape. So with students primarily focused on their own pleasure and not focused on the other partner's well-being, there's a lot of rates of coercion there. And so that's not consent in the same way, and that's incredibly problematic. Those relationships can be incredibly damaging to people's lives. So hookup culture is a rape culture. The sexual scripts of hookup culture make coercive behaviors look and feel normal. It makes a feminized interest in or concern for a partner seem bad or negative or off script. So it camouflages the behavior of rapists, and it also puts all students at risk of themselves ending up sexually assaulting someone or being part of a sexual assault. So it makes it difficult for campus activists to fight sexual violence and hold colleges accountable when it's just so normalized. So when it comes to these larger social movements, whether it's the women's movement, especially that second wave of the women's movement, during the 60s and 70s, gay liberation, and the sexual revolution, these established a new set of rules for sexuality, including an imperative to say yes to sex, to have more freedom, to have more people engaging in sexuality and have it not be as stigmatized or deviant. But sex still reflects our cultural values. It's shaped by our interactions and really by those institutional forces, as the values make their way into the institutions and then get reproduced through those kind of institutions, and we often interact with those things and internalize those messages, and those shape our behaviors and our actions. So it can feel deeply personal, obviously, our sexuality and our desire, but in many ways it's not. In many ways it has so much to do with our culture and our society.